Okay, well, get started. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our ProcureCon webinar sponsored by Vertex, Understanding Indirect Tax and the Procurement Process, Why Implementing a Tax Solution is Critical for Your Success. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to bring your attention to the Zoom webinar features in front of you. For this webinar, your audio and video will be turned off so you can have eyes and ears on today's fantastic speakers. If you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to ask away using that Q&A box in the toolbar below. If we do not get to your questions by the end of the discussion, we will make sure to follow up with you shortly after. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We have Mark Rems, Practice Leader, National Transaction Tax Services at KPMG, and Kristen Schwabenbauer, Partner Manager at Vertex. We're going to try and save some time at the end of today's discussion for audience Q&A. So please feel free to submit questions for our speakers at any time during the presentation. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Kristen. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Olivia. Thanks, everyone, for taking the time. I think Mark and I want to just give you a quick overview of what we do specifically, so you get a little bit of context, and then we'll get into the meat of things here. But in case you aren't aware, Vertex has been in business for well over 40 years. All we do is tax and tax technology services for companies, small, medium, and large, really anyone who has complex tax requirements. That's who we cater to. So with that, we've got our third generation of tax calculation system that integrates both to SAP, to Oracle, to e-commerce, to point of sale systems, all of those things. So I'm sorry, I'm getting some pop-ups here on my screen. We have well over, I would say, 1,000 employees at this point. Everything that we do is really homegrown and developed and supported by us. And we really look to empower and help companies remain compliant, as challenging as that is nowadays, and it's getting even worse. Mark, do you want to go ahead and give an overview of what you do with KPMG?
Sure, and you missed the now a public company, right?
It's true. You're right. You're right.
Congratulations on that. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for taking the time. Really excited to cover this topic, to discuss how procurement and tax are woven together. My name is Mark Rems. I'm a principal in our transaction tax systems practice. I head up the service line nationally, and I'm based in our Philadelphia office. The KPMG transaction tax systems practice, what we focus on is helping companies implement master data changes, process changes, implement technologies to help manage the indirect tax lifecycle. So those are taxes that are due based on business events like purchasing and sales. And there's a lot of requirements, and it starts with how do you calculate tax as these transactions are processing through your business systems. And today we're going to be focusing on procurement, to how do we get data under audits or customer inquiries? How do we get data for tax returns? And then in the US, you have over 300 sales and use tax returns from the state down to the local level. How do we build a process to automate those returns? So, and that's a monthly process. So it's very much a grind for companies. And now there's global e-invoicing and digital reporting requirements. So we help companies kind of streamline those processes to get better tax answers and to remit the appropriate taxes as needed. As a whole, our group has been implementing tax technology solutions for over 20 years, but we're also a full service advisory firm. So we do a lot of procurement implementations, and I can tell you, this is something we're seeing in the market. It's very heavy right now.
Yeah.
A lot of companies are looking to lower their cost structure, get efficiencies in the procurement process. So we are doing a ton of implementations of Coupa, Ariba, iValua, and the TTS team is working with our advisory partners to help automate those taxes because it's such a critical part, and we'll kind of highlight why coming up here in the conversations. And then finally, we build our own custom integrations between these various procurement systems and tax engines like Vertex. So we're very much in the weeds on how these systems work and what are some of the challenges when it comes to evaluating taxes during the procurement process.
That's great, Mark. You know what? I should mention, so Vertex and KPMG have been partnered for a long time, at least 15 years or so. And I think what it's really important to know is that KPMG is a big company and you're doing all of these global procurement transformations, but your tax group is such an important piece. So even if, you're as an attendee in the audience, if you are using KPMG, you might not be tied into the TTS group. And that's really important when you start talking about these projects, because it's such a niche and it's such a specialized thing that you guys know. Olivia, I think we have the first poll question.
Yep, our first poll question should be on everyone's screen. Is your company currently using a procurement software solution? So we'll give everyone a few seconds to answer.
Yeah, this will be interesting because, most companies right now, you start off with your ERP, right, Mark? Purchasing out of your ERP, because that's what you have. That's your basics, right?
Yeah, I guess we should have highlighted currently using or implementing, because we know of a lot of companies currently in the process of implementing.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, well, it looks like there's definitely a combination in our audience today. Kristen, why should procurement professionals care about getting tax right on their invoices? And isn't it just about getting the invoices approved and paid?
Yeah, this is kind of the really push for, and I'm going to try to find this. Here we go. Here we have the question up there. It's critical. It's a critical part of your business to get your invoices paid, right? And keep good relationships with your suppliers and with your vendors and everything else. But I think, especially with these procurement transformations, I know what Mark and I have seen is that, this little thing called tax and getting the tax right on your invoice, and are your vendors charging you the right tax, is actually a pretty big deal to a number of different groups within your organization, depending on what size organization you may be with. It's critical, and that's one of the reasons why we want to talk to you folks, because it's just to educate and build awareness and make it not so scary anymore. And so in some cases, you may not even know you have a problem. It's can you take the burden off of your AP professionals from having to make those decisions? It's trying to make sure that your company stays compliant and relevant. Tax is a key and strategic part just of the organization, just like procurement is. So there are a number of things there that really make this is something that you need to think about along with the processes, along with if you're going through a procurement transformation, or if you're, thinking of moving from an ERP and moving things into Coupa, whenever, as soon as you start having those conversations, it's team up with tax, because this is a critical and very risky part of you doing business and being strategic, and as well as being efficient and, covering all your bases. Mark, I'm trying to figure out which slide you wanted to.
I think it's the next one. It just kind of highlights some of the points, right? So, when you look at indirect tax rates, and again, these are taxes that are imposed at the transaction level, they can range from 5% to some VAT rates going up to 25%. And this is for every single line item that is coming through a procurement system. So it absolutely impacts, when you're saying you're buying $10,000 in goods, it's really not just $10,000. You have to factor in tax, and sometimes that can push it to an additional approver level, right? So being able to, as purchases come through, successfully evaluate based on the jurisdiction and the nature of the purchase, what taxes are due is critical, whether you're creating a PR, a purchase requisition, a purchase order, or an AP invoice. Another thing, a big part of implementing a procurement system is to drive down costs and make things more efficient. So part of driving down costs is stopping erroneous taxes from going out the door. So, in the US, you have common examples where your vendor doesn't know how you're going to use something. If you're buying a computer, but you're using it for R&D and manufacturing, it might be subject to an exemption. So don't let the cash go out the door and pay it to the vendor if it's not subject to tax. So that's why embedding some kind of tax intelligence like a Vertex solution as part of the procurement process actually saves you cash on hand. Mm-hmm. And also the reverse, if a vendor isn't charging you tax, but the purchase is subject to tax, and that could happen for a number of reasons. One, the vendor might not be registered in the jurisdiction they're shipping the product, or it might be a cross-border transaction. You're still on the hook, and you want to avoid penalties and interest. And a lot of times, because these procurement systems are now holding all the important data and really becoming your system of record for procurement. You need to make sure that you're driving accruals from your procurement system. Another thing I'll say is, why does it matter? I'm a CIO, or I'm a technology professional. Why do I care about tax? Well, again, these procurement systems are the front end. They hold all the information. And if you have one of these solutions, you have to build an integration to your backend GL system, your backend ERP. And a lot of these ERPs are so sensitive to the data they need when you're posting an FI only invoice. So you're required to populate a tax code, a jurisdiction code, a vendor charge tax amount, potentially a tax rate, a commodity code. If you don't have a system up front to derive those values in your procurement system, how are you going to get it down in the ERP platform? You're going to have to build that logic in your OK to pay to ERP integration, because you can't post a document in your backend ERP without some of these tax data elements. So, what we've seen is, if you invest up front to have a solution like Vertex, it actually makes that OK to pay to ERP integration so much easier when it comes to managing the tax requirements. The other thing I'll say, more from a global perspective, is if you look at all the changing legislation around real-time reporting, e-invoicing, making tax digital, that now that these solutions are a two-way portal for suppliers and buyers to be interacting, now the system of record for some of these documents and electronic data elements actually reside in your procurement system. So these e-invoicing requirements, there's not a PDF. Your vendor is going in and typing in electronic information for an invoice that's going to get routed into your Ariba or procurement system. That now is the system of record for that sale and purchase. So it's important to understand the implications of those real-time reporting and e-invoicing, and understanding what information needs to come out of your procurement system. Because if you don't have that, you're going to get nailed in audits. And in some of these countries, your officers can be held liable. So a lot there.
A lot there. It's all really good stuff, though. I mean, I think, Mark, it's evolving. It's so dynamic. And I really feel like we're just getting started with all of this, and it's only going to continue to grow. So from this standpoint, it's going to be a lot more complicated. And you're not just talking about saying, oh, Vertex, we're going to hook a third-party tax system to a Coupa or to Ariba. You have to factor in that ERP. So it almost becomes an enterprise-wide project, because you have to involve all those different parties that touch all of those different, pieces. And how do you get it all to work together? Because there's different points. You could be, doing the PO in SAP and not doing it in Coupa. There's just so many different combinations there, and it's really important to understand how complex it could be to properly set you off on the right, because it's all about the data. It's about the data in the end, and making sure that your tax folks really have what they need, and others in the company have what they need to do their jobs.
That's right. And what we see, when we're out in the market, is that education process, right? It's not just a rate table that you're using in your procurement systems. You have interfaces feeding in PRs, purchase requisitions, purchase orders. You have catalog items. You have one-time ship tos. Then you have that integration back to the ERP. This is an integration, a transformation project that really needs to focus on all the elements around procurement. And a big one is tax, for all these reasons we just talked about. And I think it's not just, our clients and prospects that are kind of going through this evolution of learning tax and procurement. It's also the procurement software companies themselves, right? If you look at, the solutions that came up in the poll, they're on their own evolution of understanding tax and the implications.
Yes,
and we're not gonna give any dirty secrets, but some are farther along than others. And how we fix that is the people on this call too. If you're looking at one of these systems, you want to bring up tax, and the more they hear from prospects and customers about how tax is important, and that, in certain countries, we need to be able to recreate our electronic invoice to prove that VAT was paid. I can tell you different procurement systems have different functionality and are at different points in being able to provide that. the more they hear from the customer base, the more they're going to understand that tax is important.
Amen. Like that. that's key and critical. Absolutely. Olivia, I think.
Yeah, Mark, I have a question for you. Could you possibly take us through the key tax touch points during the invoice payment process?
Yeah. So that's the next question that we have here. And so, we talked a lot about, the importance of tax in procurement. And I think this is another slide that'll kind of highlight that, right? Because there's so many steps in the process. And the stars here in orange are typically where we see a reach out to determine taxes. And we'll get into the specifics of that. But, the first step in the process is always getting the master data right. You have to load your vendors as part of the procurement implementations. Generally, you're building a sync from either a different vendor master or your ERP system, making sure they have the correct address elements, the right registration numbers, defining your ship to locations. You're definitely going to have predefined ship to locations in these procurement systems. Do you have a 5-digit zip or do you have the zip +4? Obviously, that makes a big difference in the US because what side of the street you're on can drive what district taxes you're subject to. And then also a big thing is the commodity codes or purchasing categories. And all these procurement systems call it a little differently. You might be using UNSPSC codes, you might be using industry specific codes or codes that you've created as a company. But the push and pull between making sure there's enough granularity for tax, so not just having a software category, because there's different rules for SaaS, electronically delivered, tangibly delivered, custom, canned, right? But also not having too many, right? If you have 40,000 different commodity codes, well, it's going to be unmanageable for users. So finding that sweet spot of 200 to 400 that you can create cheat sheets and train users to accurately pick is a big part of that master data setup. So once the data's in, right, generally the procurement process starts with a purchase requisition that's then converted to a purchase order. And that's typically where we see the first tax calculation. And again, there's different evolution of that ability to call taxes from the various procurement systems. But it's nice to have taxes there because, again, ultimately you want to know what the true expected cost is of that purchase, and tax is obviously included. It's something that you're going to have to pay to your vendor, whether you capture it as an input tax credit or not. So users want to capture that true amount. And also as part of that requisition and purchase order process, you also need to train users, again, to pick the right commodity, to, if you're entering a one-time ship to populate the address correctly, because that's all going to drive an accurate tax calculation. Once the PO is created and approved, the next step in these procurement systems is generally the goods receipt or service entry. Typically, there's not another tax calculation request at that time because you're just pulling in whatever tax was calculated at the time of the PO, and you're just recognizing that services have been received or the goods have been received. Where we see the most critical evaluation of taxes is then, okay, we've received the goods, we're verifying we received the services. Now the vendor has invoiced me, whether we received a PDF and we're keying the invoice in through the procurement system, or whether it's electronically coming through from the supplier portal. We want to validate the tax that the vendor is charging us. And that can be at the header level, it could be at the line level, it could be additional add-on charges that we have to factor in. So we need some sort of validation to say, hey, $10,000 purchase, vendor charged me $600. Is that accurate? Because again, we don't want cash going out the door if we don't have to, because it's going to take time and money to get that tax back from our vendors if it's incorrectly paid. So, and not just say, hey, we're expecting exactly $600. We want to have some tolerance system, right? To say, well, if we calculated $599 of tax, but vendor charged me $600, you probably don't want to fail the invoice, right? It's not worth the extra dollar. So you want some tolerances, and the way KPMG works is what we recommend is, having dollar tolerance thresholds, having percent tolerance thresholds, being able to combine and or logic in those tolerances, maybe special tolerances for certain commodity codes because your utility bills very hard to recreate utility tax or telecom tax calculations, right? So having that flexibility to have trusted vendors and let certain types of purchases through without a validation is another important step. But also part of the invoice verification process is, okay, I'm doing a cross-border B2B transaction from Spain to France. My vendor shouldn't be charging me VAT. That doesn't mean there's no tax consequence, right? We need to say, yes, the vendor is correct in charging me zero tax, but I need something to trigger a reverse charge mechanism, right? And that can either be by driving the right tax code and rules down from the procurement system, or then going to the next step, which is actually the invoice posting. And that's also important for tax because we're not just validating vendor charge tax, we're now making sure tax is posting to the right account. So in Canada, you have certain provinces, right, where some of the tax can be recovered, such as GST, HST, and QST, while certain provinces like Manitoba, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, that portion of the tax is expense. So having that logic to know, hey, my vendor charged me one total tax number through the supplier portal. How do I make sure to break it out accurately when the document posts so I have the right tax posting? So there's a lot of thinking that has to go on between that invoice verification and invoice posting process to make sure not only are you evaluating taxes properly, but are you posting taxes properly so you can remit the taxes, reconcile to your tax engine. Kristen, I know you're heavily involved in designing a lot of these connectors with Vertex. And anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, no, I think this is hopefully people are the audience is looking at this and it makes sense, and this is such a challenge. I think a lot of folks really understand tax because they're a consumer, right? So if you're buying something on Apple or Amazon or wherever, you see the tax, you can see it quoted, and then you can see it when you place the order. Well, with this and with indirect tax and procurement, when you're going through that purchasing process as a company, there are so many more steps, and it ends up they're really having tax on these. It's really critical in running your business. It's a critical component. I mean, if you're buying something in worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and it's subject to tax, that tax is going to be a substantial amount, right? So you need to understand that along the way. And there's also a paper trail, because this is so complicated, because things, you may get things shipped to your headquarters in Pennsylvania, but maybe those laptops need to go out to your employees who are remote. So where are they using those laptops? And things like that really start to play, like goods movement and things like that start to play a big part in this too. So, I mean, I think just trying to understand that there's different touch points. There's different things that you could potentially do between your ERP and between, your Ariba's or your Coupas. And they all have, I think the important thing too is Ariba and Coupa and TradeShift and iValua, they all have their different takes on this process, right? And so does like an SAP or an Oracle. So getting down in the weeds and really trying to figure out, okay, where are we going to do this? What kind of functionality are we going to have? Because Mark, as you mentioned, everyone's at different stages of this. There's I would say that the procurement, best to be procurement providers are at the early stages of building out their partner ecosystems. So you're not going to have all the functionality that Mark is referring to, or you may have to custom build something. But it still doesn't mean that you don't need to have this and really be identifying them and making sure you can address and collect this information. And that's why, Vertex really, if you look at Vertex, we can help with this whole process at any point in time. You have your rates, you can handle the complexities, of the tax drivers and things like that. What we refer to as tax drivers. So, how you're, with indirect tax and procurement, it's really how you're using the item, and not just what you purchase. It's not just a pass-through sales tax. It's, how are you using it? Where is it being used? When is it being used? All of those things really come into play. It's just a matter of how do you get the data to a Vertex to let us do our thing and make sure that, you're covered there, and then get it back so that you can, keep on with the processing and keep moving things along quickly and efficiently. Because I mean, if you're looking at processing, 300,000 plus invoices a year, that's substantial, and it's a big risk, and it's a big burden. Olivia?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Kristen and Mark, for those insights. So let's go on to our next poll question. Our question is, does your organization have an automated process for handling tax in the P2P process? Give a few seconds for you all to answer.
You know, the audience might not even know.
Well, that's funny too, because with these cloud solutions, it's not like it's the 2-year on-premise SAP rollout that everyone's focused on. Some of these, cloud solutions are implemented in, weeks and months. And next thing you know, hey, I need to get a report out of this. What is this new procurement system?
Coupa, what? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. Good. And it's funny too, because like with a third-party tax calculation system, you're not really supposed to even know it's there. It's supposed to just stay in the background. It's just supposed to be your tax department's ERP, where they set up and it's their control center. So, if you're a point of sale, or you have point of sale systems and you're, a retailer, or you have e-commerce, it's, behind the scenes there. But it'd also be hooked to your ERP. So, but a lot of people might not even, especially in procurement, might not even know it's there. So that's okay. This is good feedback.
And Kristen, a question for you off of that poll is, why use a tax engine in your P2P transformation?
I honestly, Mark, and this might be a question for you too. Like, I don't know how people do it without one. I know there's native functionality. There's always native functionality in whatever system you're using, but to be able to keep up with the rates and the rules and the regulations, especially when we're talking about not only in the US, which is very complex, but as soon as you get out of the US and you're doing business globally. I just don't know, how folks do it. I know it's a combination sometimes, but using it and pairing a tax calculation system, an implementation like this, if you're implementing, for instance, Ariba, and then you're also going to implement a Vertex system, they run the implementations run parallel. So you scope things out, you configure and set up at the same time, you'll do testing at the same time, and then you go live at the same time. So it's a lot less intensive when you're talking about a tax calculation system as compared to an Ariba or a Coupa, but they run in parallel. So it actually complements it. And I think that's a big part. I think a lot of what we're seeing a lot of is procurement folks going out and saying, okay, we're looking at a Coupa, we pick Coupa, and this is where we want to go. And then tax is the last to know. And they say, whoa, hey guys, we need to be a part of this. How are we going to take care of all of the things that Mark just spoke about, on the wheel? So I think those things are really important. But Mark, I'd like to get your feedback on that. What are you seeing, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, maybe if you go to the next slide, I think it level sets on what are options, right, in terms of managing all the tax requirements we talked about. And it sounds like half the people on this call, right, are in option one, where there's really no formal tax automation. Hopefully, at least you're separately stating vendor charge tax, right, to report that you're paying the tax, because that's obviously very important in audits. And you know what, that I think historically speaking, if you're a company, right, that is in a couple states, a couple countries, right, maybe you can get by with that. And that also applies to option two, where you have these native capabilities within these procurement solutions to essentially you're building a logic matrix behind the scene, and you have a rate code table, right, where AP can pick tax codes, and it's a single rate per tax code. And then you can have a lookup table where you map which commodity code based on which country maps to which tax code. If you're only in a few jurisdictions, maybe that works, right, because there is a cost of implementation. But now in the new world, right, especially the post-COVID world and current COVID world, right, where workers are at home, and now you have hundreds of ship to locations, not just 4 offices where everything is shipped,
right,
that becomes very hard to maintain in a lookup table. So in order to accurately validate vendor charge tax and accrue taxes now for all these new locations, you really have to lean on a system. And I know we have a slide coming up here with specifically focuses on why a tax engine on the procurement process. But obviously, you need to build the business case for a solution like this. But when you start to look at, all the different jurisdictions in play, all the different types of commodities in play, how much a solution like a Vertex can simplify the integration from OK to pay to the backend ERP, because it'll drive all the tax elements that you already need. That business case builds pretty quickly and efficiently. But I'm never going to say there's not a business case for, either going with option 1 or option 2, but I can tell you, every week we're going through this business case with clients out there, and more are going with that option 3 just because of the complexities that we've mentioned.
Yeah, and it's about getting folks the right tools to do their jobs, and the ROI is considerable. So while, an implementation like this and the software in and of itself, subscription wise, can be, substantial, I think the ROI is pretty phenomenal. And, once it's in place, it's in place. And you really, I think the attitude towards it is automate as much as you possibly can. You might not be able to get there 100% with the tools and with everything, the technology where it is, but automate as much as you possibly can. And at least, you're winning, but you're winning at some level.
Yeah, because, something that I'll tell clients, right, is, a big part of this is why you're implementing a procurement system is to reduce the manual touches, create that automated invoicing network, no touch invoicing, right? So if that's a core goal of yours, why would you not also apply that to tax, right? Why would you have manual processes with tax when you've invested all this money to implement a state-of-the-art automated procurement solution that increases efficiencies, it reduces costs, and allows you to automate a lot more?
Yeah. I was doing, I was having a conversation with one of our experts globally. I think he's in the Netherlands. And he was like, he mentioned your KPI should be quality. You should have one KPI that's quality when it comes to this. And it's true. You are, it's right. It's very easy, especially with, as Ariba starts to morph with Fieldglass and Concur, and it becomes its own kind of ERP for procurement. And Coupa is adding more and more products to their, suite and to their platform. It's easy to, focus on contract negotiations or, contract management or spend analysis and all of these things. But this is something that, tax is something that no one really handles very well if you're not a third-party tax engine, right? So, it needs to be touched upon. It needs to be, at least, you need to understand, have a little bit of an understanding of it, and how important it is, and how to pull it in when you do these things. And I think that's just key and critical. And Mark, forgive me.
I think there was a question. Yeah, there was a question around how to go about building this business case and what inputs should you use. And we've done this a couple of times, right? And it obviously you need to know the costs of the technology that you're looking to implement, the cost of implementation. That's one side of the ledger. But then the other side, right, is how much spend do you have, right? What is your typical error rate per transaction? And you want to look at both sides of it, right? An error rate where cash is going out the door, right, that it shouldn't be. And if you're not doing a reverse audit or some due diligence about that, then you're losing, in the US, 6 to 11% bottom line. And if you're not getting VAT right, it could be, 15 to 25%. There's also if you not driving accruals, right, you have penalties and interests, and this can be pretty punitive in jurisdictions. So typically what we do is, we try to gather data from clients. Have you been through a reverse audit? Do you do this monthly process, or do you an annual review? And what is your typical error rate? And then you multiply that error rate by overall spend. You look at both sides, penalties and interest for under accruing and money going out the door. And even if you do pay a firm to come in and get that money back in a reverse audit, you're spending 30% of that. So there's definitely some math you can work through. And that's just, the dollars part of it. The other part is, how to reduce the overall integration with your ERP to your OK to pay file, right? Because we see that from a tax perspective, this significantly reduces that effort. So there'll be hours gained from that. There'll be hours gained from AP because now you have an automated process. If the vendor isn't charging you the right tax, you just reject the invoice. It goes back to the vendor and they deal with all the work around, well, why did this get rejected? I charged this tax. Was that the right tax? Right? All that work versus if someone is manually keying it and someone calls out, hey, that's not the right tax, they have to call someone from the tax department, figure out what's going on. Or even worse, if you have a system already integrated with your backend ERP and you don't have a process up front in OK to pay, that invoice comes all the way through, hits OK to pay, then goes down to the ERP, and then there's a tax validation that occurs. Right. Well, now you've said it's OK to pay, but the invoice gets rejected in your ERP. That is very costly to unwind. It's very hard to do. So those are the inputs that I'd be looking at when I'm coming up with this business case. Yeah, completely. That's your last scenario was actually pretty scary. I can't imagine how you would back out of that one. Yeah, that's not easy. Yeah, and it does. It comes down to 20. I'm totally dating myself now. I've been at Vertex for over 20 years. So a million years ago, when sales tax was a big thing, people just wanted to be compliant for sales tax. I mean, you're talking about class action lawsuits and the whole thing with retailers. It was, you don't want your sales reps or your order entry folks making tax decisions. It's the same thing for the AP. You take that burden off of them, give them the tools that they need, and then gain these efficiencies and everything else that we've mentioned. Mark, I can't see if there's any other questions that are popping in. Do we? I think that was the only one.
We have one more actually. Okay. This is primarily for you, Kristen. We have a Vertex implementation right now with Oracle, but don't have an option built out to validate vendor charge tax. Is that a quick adjustment we can do in Vertex/Oracle?
It's an adjustment you definitely can do. Absolutely. Yeah, that's been around for a long time. And Mark, you probably know it much better than I do, but you can do, I mean, it would be a project, but you can absolutely do it. Mark, do you want to touch base on or touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, and was it Oracle Cloud or I guess either way, whether it's R12 or right. Oracle Cloud, Vertex has a pre-built connector, right? Mm-hmm. It even calls at the time of the PO, but certainly during invoice validation, you subscribe the AP side and whatever regimes you want tax validation within Oracle. And it does exactly what I had talked about on the prior slide, that as long as you're separately stating the vendor charge tax with line type tax, there's a process to call Vertex. The connector is already built. It's been battle tested. It works to do exactly what we had highlighted before, and all the benefits that we had talked about definitely pertain to that scenario with Oracle. And if you already have a Vertex license and you have really Oracle, I mean, the business case is there, right? Yeah. Why are you not using it on the AP? Yeah, and I think that's how a lot of organizations that we work with kind of phase these projects in, right? So you can use Vertex for sales tax, for what we call consumer use tax, value-added tax on the supplier or the customer side, consumer side. So you're just talking about an additional, getting access to additional functionality and data and things like that. And then, purchasing an additional license for an integration and, talking with your alliances or whoever you work with to help you out with that implementation, and planning it. But I think that, that it would be an easy case to build for sure in that situation. Yeah, and that's, if you look at where do you want to be as an organization when it comes to indirect taxes, it's having that central intelligence, right? One place to go for all your reports. So you're not getting a spreadsheet of purchases out of Oracle and having to go through and see where you need to pick up additional use tax accruals. And some companies just do that. They don't even look at the vendor side, right, where they paid taxes out. But if you're an R&D and manufacturing company, how do you know you're actually paying the right taxes based on how something is being used? So you want one place to go to get your reports, one place to go as you have business changes, right? So, you acquire a new entity, you create a new company with its own Nexus settings, right? One place to go to update that, whether we're talking about sales or purchasing, right? That's the end state you want to be at, that you have a single engine that's centrally located that you
Right.
use to drive your tax policy and to drive your tax reporting and compliance.
Yeah, that's huge. That's if you're not already doing that, that's key and critical. It's as important, I think, as these purchasing systems, taking the purchasing out of the ERP. All right, so I wanted to just see, Mark, you had mentioned another.
I think there's one more slide that really zeroes in on why Vertex, right? And I can start it out, right? And on the left is just kind of the blocking and tackling of tax engines, right? That there's APIs available, there's connectors available. The big thing, right, is it's not just rate updates, it's also
Right.
content updates. And that's, as rules change, especially, in the US, states are looking for more revenue. They're diving into the service side that historically could have been exempt, but now, everything is jumbled together. Is it information services? Is it SaaS? Is it marketing services, right? More and more digital service taxes are coming up, right? So whether those things are taxable or not are also rules that get pushed in by Vertex each month. So it's not just determining the rates, it's determining the right taxability, setting up roles and securities for SOX and the ability to get reports, right? That's all the benefit just from a pure tax engine, from a pure Vertex side. In the middle is, all right, if I'm trying to convince IT why we need this is what we want to focus on, right? That you can't just use rate tables, right? Because of all the rate and rule changes that are happening. If you truly want to make the AP process efficient, don't have people make decisions to manually enter tax codes on the AP side. You want to kind of, follow that core value of what's driving the overall procurement implementation, driving the right GL postings in the ERP, right? If you don't have anything upfront on the purchasing side, how do you drive, well, GST goes to this input tax account, PST for two different expenses needs to be split and go to these two different expense accounts. That's going to be programming logic in your interface.
Right.
And also, having a more sophisticated tax approval process, right? Being able to define thresholds by companies or by purchasing type or by legal entity, right? Overall, having that tax engine is going to make taxes more accurate, but make things a whole lot more efficient on the procurement side, which is really one of the major goals on implementing one of these procurement systems. And then, just overall value, right? Improve cash flow, right? We talked about this, building the business case, reduce penalties and interests. And again, those can be pretty high, especially in certain countries. And just simplifying that back end implementation and the services to integrate OK to pay to the ERP system. So we see a lot of benefit. Obviously, we've done a lot of these projects with Vertex, and these are the big parts that really drive that decision to ultimately invest, because it is investment up front. But over time, as you use the platform from an efficiency standpoint, from an accuracy standpoint, we typically see the ROI coming back in 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, no doubt. And yeah, I think it continues to bring value. I mean, and once you do a project like this, it's there. I mean, it's staying there for a good number of years. So I mean, and that's why we take this so seriously, and why when we talk to clients, and I know, Mark, you guys do the same thing. It's we really want to understand, okay, what are your requirements? What are you doing? Do you have goods movement? Do you have where is that going to be handled? I mean, that's a big topic. Are you moving inventory? Taking inventory out to use it for other things? All of those things will help you try to figure out, hey, what's the right path for us in putting this all together. And that's just going to immediately help increase the ROI for this as well. I guess I can't say that enough. This is like an enterprise type of a project, really, that can cross functions and groups within within your organization. So it's huge, and why not use a third-party system where all you have to do is map what you're purchasing, your categories or the quantity codes or what have you, to Vertex. And what we have, and Mark, your good example was the software. There's so many different ways to buy software. Well, you don't need to worry about that. We can handle that for you, and we'll cover that, and we keep that updated. So at least eliminate things like that as much as possible. I think that's really going to support you and set you up strategically to really, keep the company within a reasonable amount of risk. Because Mark, as you had mentioned, you can get audited. You might not really even get, a penalty. They could. I'm trying to figure out how to say this. You could not get fined, but if someone comes in and says, you know what, we think you didn't do this correctly, we think you should have been paying tax to this vendor or to this whatever, then it still comes off the books. Can you, Mark, I know I'm babbling a little bit, but that happens all the time. I mean, it's still, and that's your bottom line. Like if it's $500,000, it's off. That's $500,000 that you can't use. It's off the books, and it stays off the books for 5 to 10 years, depending on your company policy. So it's a really big deal.
Yeah, and sometimes you can get into a double whammy, right? Where if the vendor charged you tax in one state and you pay it, but then you've shipped that laptop to a different state, that state is going to want the tax as well, right? And they might say, sure, you shouldn't have paid tax on the first one, go back and get it, but I still want my tax.
Right. Yeah, good luck going back and getting it. That takes some time, for sure.
And so there is a question that came in around category codes. We talked about how critical that field is when you're creating a purchase requisition, and suggestions on how to automate that category code selection. The simple thing is just to say, well, create the cheat sheets, right? Train users, but users are coming in and out, right? And, what are some other ways to help enable procurement folks to select the accurate category? And just two that come to top of mind, right, is, and again, this is where you need to probe IT and understand, what are the capabilities within the procurement system? Because I know different procurement solutions handle this differently, but having automated commodity codes or additional fields, right, that become activated depending on users selecting other fields. So for example, right, instead of having 200 categories that you select from, maybe have 10 where it's broken into a higher category. They pick from one of the 10, and then based on that value, another commodity code comes up with a more granular set that they have to pick from, right? And driving more of a workflow than just picking a value. I know some of the procurement systems, you can actually create those additional fields or build intelligence behind the scenes that, hey, if user is from this department, they generally buy one of 10 categories instead of 200. So cool. If it's from that department, only show these 10 commodity codes. And now procurement, the argument that, well, I can't have my user pick from 500. Well, they're not. Now they're only picking from, yes, very granular categories for software, but we've eliminated, all these other commodity codes, life insurance and other values that they don't buy from. So they should be able to pick, even though they're very granular, only one of 20. Right. So looking at ways that you can automate the population of either the commodity code field itself, or we've definitely had custom fields added that become activated based on selection of that commodity code to really drill down into, all right, well, they picked insurance out of the standard commodity. I don't care about that, right? From a US perspective, I'm going to, generic tax answer is fine. But if they pick software, a second field gets populated and it has the different software granularity that we need to drive the right tax decision. So that helps you drive the business case that, well, look, it's just one extra click for the user. They're only going to see it if they pick, these three commodities out of the 200. So that's where we've worked together with procurement to get to the right answers that we need.
Okay. That's
I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I think that's a fantastic. I guess I haven't connected the dots on that recently, and being able to really hone in. Everyone's talking about, it's almost like AI behind the scenes, right? You're setting it up, you're programming it, configuring it, and making it easier for the internal users just to be able to get through that process more quickly and have to think less, and then you're going to get more accurate results. So I think that's fantastic, and that's a great example.
Yeah, and there's another example, right? Is market data, right? It's big in financial services companies that a user is going in. They're not going to create 100 different ship tos because that market data is being used by 100 offices, right? We've worked with companies that say, hey, if they pick the market data commodity code, then show another field that has well, which departments are using it, right? And they select which departments because, if it's commodities, maybe it's only the commodity division that's using that commodity market data. If it's, overall, financial data about country and revenues and GDP, well, maybe that's every office that uses it. So depending on picking that market data commodity, having additional fields that they can select, and then whatever departments they pick, linking that to HR data that actually has the employee locations that are assigned to that department, so you can allocate the accruals to the right states. Now that's more advanced, but if you're a financial services company and you're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on market data, those accruals add up.
Yeah, I would imagine that would be significant and well worth the timing and effort to get that in place and make sure that you have that underlying structure to help support that, for sure.
That's right.
Did we get another question or two? I know I'm gonna pop.
Yeah, I have a few on my end. One attendee asked, if you need to pick the main benefits of P2P tax automation, what would those be?
Gosh, the main ones.
Yeah,
There's so many.
Yeah, from my standpoint, right, it's accuracy, which results in less cash going out the door when it shouldn't, and less penalties and interests under audit. 2 is efficiencies, right? That you're not having users pick things, everything is automated. If the vendor charges you the wrong tax, your business just kicks it back and say, Mr. or Mrs. Supplier, you deal with this. I'd also say regulation, right? I had talked about, e-invoicing, digital reporting, right? And these procurement systems now being the last place to go to get the documentation you need under audit, right? For example, a lot of our clients, under audit, an auditor will come in and say, all right, here's 100 invoices. I want to see copies of these invoices. They're no longer in the ERP, they're in the procurement system. So have you implemented a process to take a data file with 100 invoice numbers and automatically extract the PDFs? Same concept, when we talk about e-invoicing and digital reporting, right, is especially for these EDI invoices that come through, these procurement systems actually auto-generate a PDF copy of the invoice, and that becomes your proof of taxes paid, right? So it's not cost, it's not efficiency, it's actually regulation driving that. So I think those are the big 3: cost, efficiency, regulation.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. It was perfectly stated, to be honest, and a very good question.
Great, and I think we have one last question before we wrap up today's presentation. The question is, from your perspective, what are the core challenges a company faces when selecting and implementing a tax automation solution for P2P?
Yeah, I can jump in real fast. From our standpoint, it's understanding the integrations that are available, right? Because there's different technology depending on the procurement solution you're implementing, the capabilities within the procurement system for even asking for a tax amount, right? Because I can tell you some procurement solutions, they actually don't even have an API call out, even for native calculations as part of the PRPO process. So just understanding the native capabilities, and that's where you might, look to a KPMG or a Vertex to help educate on what's possible, right, within these procurement systems. And then the third thing, a big challenge is just making sure the master data is accurate, because you could implement the best technology in the world, have the best connector in the world, be calling tax when you need it. But if you don't have accurate information in your procurement system, a big one is the how of how you're buying something, right? If you're buying a computer, you might have a commodity code computer, but how do you know whether it's being used for R&D, manufacturing, or back office, right? And a lot of these procurement systems, you'll have to lean on the cost object, and drilling down into that cost object, what field or information is going to tell you how it's being used, which can affect the taxability of the transactions.
Yeah, that's good. And with regards to one of your first points, I think the devil's in the details, and I would not assume that that the functionality that you think is going to be there is going to be there, when you're talking about a Coupa or an Ariba or anything. Like Mark had mentioned, they may not even have a tax API. They might not even have anything for native to do. So it's kind of all over the place. And so what I've seen is a lot of procurement professionals just making assumptions, and even like IT professionals just making assumptions. I have conversations with folks weekly about, and they'll say to me, come on, Kristen, it's not there. And I'm like, no, it's not there. I'm sorry. The functionality will get there. We're working on it. I think one of the things that you have to understand is that from a technology perspective, while SaaS and cloud is great and has made things a lot easier, it's actually made, I think, partnering a little bit more challenging, because you can't go in and rig things like we used to be able to. I'm sure Mark has done quite a bit of that in the past. You got to wait until the Coupas and the Vertexes get together and program it and plan it out. And those are big projects. So I would just, be in contact with the people that you're trusted advisors, and you're going to, be as up to date as possible. And that's would be my advice.
Another question came in around software being purchased in New York, vendors charging 100%, right? Software is being used all across the country. The approach I would take, right, is one is you can go to the vendor, right? And if it's somewhat of a consistent allocation, have them break out the sales tax. It's certainly not an uncommon thing we've seen our clients be requested to do when billing customers. More likely, though, they're not going to do that, and you'll have to implement a process on your side. And some of the ways you do this, it can be done real time, right, as the invoice is being validated. Others, you can implement an automated process. And when you're doing these allocations, a lot of time that'll have to be an automated process, but essentially build a process that pulls the data either out of your ERP or OK to pay. And for these software purchases, I would provide a vendor a multi-point of use certificate or similar certificate, so you're not paying tax up front. And then getting the data out of the system and linking it to the right ship tos and allocations. And you can build an automated process for this that can actually link to your HR information. So as departments change and different users are from different states, or even in some cases, financial services companies might have a terminal in one state that's being accessed from users all across the country. So you need to figure out who's logging into that terminal and going back to their location, building an automated allocation process that can leverage Vertex, but more of a batch process. And Vertex has a BCI to do this. But certainly you can build automation to actually do exactly that, as long as you're not paying the vendor, and building a process to self-assess the use tax based on that allocation process.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Another question, benefits to using Coupa. I think that goes back to the overall paradigm of companies moving to the best in breed procurement solutions. I think with companies moving their business systems from on-premise to cloud, which we're seeing a lot of, right, it now opens the doors to integrate all these solutions. So we are seeing companies do best in breed for CRM, best in breed for data visualizations, best in breed for procurement. Coupa specifically, right, you've now created an online marketplace, right, which creates competition between vendors, which drives down cost. You have a touchless invoicing process, right? Vendors have their own portal that they log in. They electronically enter invoices or post their own invoices, so that reduces your manual efforts. There's a lot of sophistication around catalogs integrated with Coupa. So it's one-click purchasing, which again, saves time on your part. So there's a lot of benefits to using a procurement solution out there. Then we have one more question. With US supply chain obstacles making headlines, would adoption of a third-party tax engine be any use to organizations to ultimately receive purchase goods in hand any faster? I wish that was the case. I know I had ordered some golf clubs that are been out there for 3 months. I wish implementing Vertex. It's not going to help you get your goods faster. I think because of some of these supply chain issues, you're going to see changes in supply chain, which means ordering from different countries, potentially different delivery locations. So it will impact your ability to evaluate taxes, how you evaluate taxes, and your compliance. So I think it's definitely something to think about when it comes to taxes and supply chain. It's just, I wish Vertex could speed up some of my deliveries.
We can help you with, paying your invoices faster and more efficiently, and you're going to have a better relationship with your suppliers. That's about where it stops, though. Olivia, I think, do we have?
Great. Well, I think that is, I think that's all the questions we have for today. I want to thank you all so much to our audience for joining us. If you do have any more questions for Mark and Kristen, please feel free to leave them in that Q&A section and we'll get back to you shortly. You can also look forward to receiving this presentation directly to your email inbox within 24 hours. So keep a lookout for that. And finally, a huge thank you and round of applause to our fantastic speakers today. Great job. Please remember to leave feedback and suggestions for us in the survey at the close of the webinar, and we'll use that feedback to guide us in producing upcoming webinar topics so that we can keep giving you exactly what you want. So with that, I'll bring this program to an end. On behalf of ProcureCon, Vertex, and the WVR Insights team, we thank you for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.